America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Toni Angelini, Senior Vice President of Operations and Advocacy.
Please subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. Today, we are joined by Professor Nick Giordano. Nick is a professor of political science, the host of the PAS Report podcast, and a fellow at Campus Reform's Higher Education Fellowship. With 2 decades of teaching experience and over a decade of experience in the emergency management homeland security arena, Professor Giordano is regularly called on to speak about issues related to government, politics, and international relations. Today, Professor Giordano joins us to answer why Americans are not horrified by Vice President Harris's economic plan. Nick, welcome to Main Street Matters.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, I mean, this is a topic that we talk about all the time because we obviously represent small business at Job Creators Network. We fight for free enterprise. We fight for the free markets. We believe that's the greatest way to pull people out of poverty. But yet, I read your op-ed. I looked at the stats from Pew Research, and we look at those stats all the time too. And we continue to we don't understand it. How are Americans not horrified by socialism and socialistic policies?
Well, and I think Americans should look at the younger generation and be horrified because 44% of them have a favorable view of socialism and only 40% of them have a favorable view of capitalism. And what's remarkable is we see the vice president, she laid out her economic vision of price controls, something that's failed in numerous countries before us, $25,000 down payment on mortgages for first-time home buyers, student loan debt relief, and it's just a way to try and bribe society to get support. But 30 years ago, if you made those proposals in a presidential campaign, your campaign would be over. It would have been political suicide. Today, we actually see that there are high levels of support, including a YouGov poll that came out where 64% of respondents supported price controls on food and energy. So something dramatic has shifted in our society, and it's intentional, and that's the education system. Mm-hmm. We have an education system that has failed to educate students on capitalism, what capitalism is, and how capitalism has lifted millions upon millions upon millions of people out of poverty, not just here in the United States, but around the world. At the same time, they demonize capitalism, they romanticize socialism, even though it's been tried and failed everywhere in the world, where it only leads to misery and poverty and death. And yet here we are, where young people particularly support socialism within our society. So I think something has horribly gone wrong in the education system. And if we look at certain faculty members, right, we see on college campuses, the Marquette University, where a faculty member tells the class that liberty, freedom equals capitalist violence. You have capitalism being equated to slavery and oppression and racism, where none of these are true. Without capitalism, America would not be the country it is today. And unfortunately, we're losing that as people look to the government to solve every single problem that exists out there.
Yeah, amazing. You know, it's just to tell you kind of a side personal story. I was visiting my daughter this weekend, who lives a couple hours from me, and my other daughter came with me, and they're 21 and 23. I will tell you on the outset, both of them are fiscally conservative. But we played the game of life. Do you remember that game?
I actually played it last night with my 8-year-old.
That should be mandatory for every child to play. There's a child version too. We played the adult version, but it was funny because as we were going around the board, it was like, get your paycheck, then pay half of your paycheck in taxes. And it's one step forward and 3 steps back. And that's in the game of life that's, probably 50 or 60 years old. It's amazing to me that these messages about capitalism, free market, and yes, capitalism is a bad word now. And we've had to work on our messaging and how we talk about it to the American public. We talk about the free market. We talk about free enterprise. It is capitalism. It's what made this country the greatest country in the world and created the largest middle class in the world. I mean, there are countries that don't have a middle class. They have rich and poor. That's it. And that's because they don't have a free market system where people can pull themselves up. And it's been such a frustrating thing. I loved reading your op-ed. I agree with every single thing in here. And I guess I have to ask you, what's the solution?
Well, education is always the solution. Unfortunately, for too long, we've allowed leftists to control the education system. And at Campus Forum, that's what we highlight. I mean, if you go to the University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, you could grab a bite to eat at the Che Cafe. You go to Washburn University, you could visit the Mao Zedong bust that they have on display. You go to Yale or New York University, and you could join a Marxist working group. Now, when you bring up to students, Milton Friedman or Thomas Sowell, Ayn Rand, they have no idea who these people are. They've never been exposed to these people, and that's the problem. They've never been exposed to what capitalism is really about. So the only thing the students hear is that a company is going bankrupt, the CEO gets like a $30 million parachute, and all the employees get laid off. That's all they hear. They only hear the negative, where that's not really capitalism. And what I like to do in my classroom is point out, because we have a very recent test case, and that's Venezuela. And all we have to do, Hugo Chavez came into power promising to equalize the resources out, promising to create equity within his country. Now, Venezuela used to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It was the wealthiest country in South America. Once Hugo Chavez took over, they had a vibrant middle class. Well, the rich didn't suffer because many of the rich either had the money to leave the country or they were tied in with the Chavez regime and still benefited making money. The people that were impoverished, well, they stayed impoverished. The only thing Chavez and Venezuela did was they gutted the middle class and made them poor. And the situation became desperate, where there were reports that Venezuelans were killing zoo animals in order to feed themselves. So it's not like we have to look far around the world. Venezuela, North Korea. We see what's going on in Cuba today. I mean, most Americans don't see it because, God forbid, our media actually puts it on the air. But in Cuba, you have mass power outages. You have food shortages going on. You have the government that's throwing people in prison. We see it fails time and time again. So if we want to solve this problem, we have to instill not only just teaching about capitalism, but we have to instill the attributes that are necessary with capitalism. The idea of hard work and merit, the idea that you're in charge of your own destiny, the idea, the American identity of liberty and freedom, that you put in what you get out of this country. And yes, some people are going to have more obstacles than other people. But the reality is that if you push and you overcome your failures, you can succeed and live the American dream. I was really disappointed when I was watching the Democrat National Convention. You had Oprah Winfrey, a billionaire, talking about wealth inequality and gender pay, the gender gap pay. And then you had Michelle Obama, a multimillionaire, talking about how people should not live beyond their means, as she has 4 palaces. Now, think about the powerful message. These are 2 highly influential people in the United States, and they faced obstacles growing up and succeeding in the world. Now, how powerful would it have been instead if they gave a speech talking about, we worked really hard and we faced obstacles and we faced the challenges and we overcame them. We persevered and we achieved the American dream. That would have been a powerful message. But instead, we see this wealthy elite attacking wealthy elite, and we see this brainwashing that's going on throughout academia. And there's very few people that have a voice that are standing up and defending capitalism and the success of capitalism. And the students are ignorant. I mean, it's the only way to say it. They constantly talk about this idea of quote unquote democratic socialism, which doesn't exist in reality. And they'll always point to the Nordic nations. However, according to the American Enterprise Institute, the Nordic nations have a freer economy than the United States. The United States economy is actually heavily regulated by the government. And so when you look and speak to people, they don't even know what they're talking about. And yet, unfortunately, we're seeing this pervasive socialism creep into every aspect of society.
We sure are. You were talking about students earlier in it. One of my favorite sort of takeaways from the Columbia takeover that happened at the end of last spring semester was when they had to shut down campus because it got so completely out of control. And you had these demonstrators on TV holding essentially a press conference complaining that no one was providing them water. And so you have these students who are just, spoiled beyond measure to begin with, who didn't understand that their actions were the direct result in them being thirsty. They wanted to know, where everybody was, there to help them. And there seems to be this disconnect between, compassion as a society and the fact that capitalism allows us to stay a free and open society. How can we educate, especially these children who have absolutely no frame of reference, historically or otherwise, that you can be compassionate for each other, but you also have to make sure that the regulatory environment is conducive to businesses succeeding? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, I think you bring up an important point, Toni. I mean, when you say compassion, part of the problem has been that these students have been told that socialism is compassion, right? That capitalism is such a horrible system, it leaves people behind. So you have to adopt socialism because it's more compassionate. And that's a difficult measure to break through. I mean, when you have two politicians and one politician is telling you that they're going to cut funding for government programs. They're going to end government programs because we're going to take care of the debt and everyone's going to feel the pain, but we're going to have to sacrifice so that we're fiscally solvent decades down the road for future Americans. And then you have another politician coming along saying, well, no, I want to invest more money in your child's education because I care about children. And that other politician hates children. I want to invest more money in our defense to keep you safe. And they don't want to keep us safe. They want other countries to take advantage. And I want to invest more money in our infrastructure to make sure you go across bridges. It's a very difficult message to break through because people are going to vote for the politician that's offering everything under the sun, despite the hundreds of years of evidence going all the way back to ancient Greece that these policies are notable failures, that they don't work anymore. And you bring up the campus protesters. At Campus Forum, we did a great man on the street interview with one of our reporters asking students to define socialism. And none of the students could define socialism. And we've been covering these protests. So think about this. They're taking over college campuses with their designer clothes, with their cell phones, where many of them are ordering Uber Eats and other capitalistic businesses, using their iPads and their Google phones, iPhones. It truly is stunning that they don't realize their own hypocrisy. But then again, you also have trans and queers for Palestine. So it's hard to really break through. And that's where I always argue that our education system has fundamentally collapsed. So it's the responsibility of parents to begin to educate their own children if the schools are not going to do it. It's important for parents to teach their kids not just, reading, writing, and math, but to teach them a work ethic, to teach them that there's no such thing as entitlement, that it should not exist, that this sense of entitlement has destroyed the United States. and that it's incumbent on us to work hard and achieve what we want to achieve, set goals for ourselves. Unfortunately, that message is getting lost because of the victimhood mentality that's been pushed into these students' head that America is an unjust system. I mean, another way to solve this problem very simply is every student, if they want a high school diploma, they have to spend 3 weeks to a month in one of the most horrible countries we could find out there. We'll keep them safe, but put them in a horrible country so that they could enjoy and appreciate all the luxuries that they have here in the United States, particularly concepts like liberty and freedom. That would go a long way because a lot of these people have been insulated from the horrors of the world. They've been insulated from what the real world is like. It's why Eastern Europeans actually have a high turnout of voting here in the United States. Many of them are still alive that escaped communism. They know what it's like to live under that type of system, and they thoroughly reject it. And so you need people to really fully experience it so that they see that it's not all that it's cracked up to be.
Yeah, that is for sure. We have an advocate program at Job Creators Network where we basically provide a platform for small business owners to sort of tell their stories and to explain the difficulties of being a small business owner. And we have an incredible amount of Cuban small business owners, a lot of them restaurateurs, and no one is a better advocate for how awful these policies can be than these restaurateurs who were able to come to America and truly live their American dream by opening up a restaurant, something that they never would have been able to do at home. And they're some of the hardest working people, you will ever talk to. I was curious when I was looking at your bio, and Elaine referenced it in the beginning, that you had emergency management experience. I had the distinct pleasure of being in charge of recovery from Superstorm Sandy for the state of New Jersey, Monmouth and Ocean County. And it was really, truly a baptism by fire for me in sort of how terribly inconsistent regulations can be at the state and federal level. And it was, I think in sort of in the scheme of my life, it was the most eye-opening experience. And that I realized, God forbid there's another storm that comes through or something else happens. No one is coming to save you. Everybody thinks that, your local state governments are going to rebuild your house and make it even better than it was before. But the bottom line, and what I learned from that experience, was that the environment and what happens to your home and your personal property really fall on you, whether you like it or not, at the end of the day. And I'm just curious if your OEM experience has opened your eyes to sort of what the government can do well, and sort of the dangers of convincing people that, the government's going to come with a checkbook to bail you out, sort of how that can impact us outside of crisis management.
Well, I could tell you during Superstorm Sandy, I was stationed in the New York City Emergency Operations Center, and I was experiencing it firsthand where I saw. Now, there's a couple of facets here. So when it comes to government regulations, in Breezy Point and Rockaways, they were devastated. And there's a lot of nursing home facilities, adult living facilities in these areas. And one of the regulations was that every adult nursing facility has to have a generator. Now, that sounds great. But they didn't specify where the generator had to be. So many of these facilities had generators on either ground level, and if they had a basement, it was in the basement. So they got destroyed in the flooding. The salt water destroyed those generators, and they were useless. This is what happens when government bureaucrats are making all the rules. They don't understand the complexities. And it's not like they consult the emergency managers either. When it comes to individual assistance claims, there are still claims open from individuals dealing with Superstorm Sandy. So we're now talking about 11, going on 12 years this October. It will be 12 years. And there are still claims open. Anyone who relies on government, you rely at your own peril on them. But again, this goes back to an education system that has indoctrinated entire generations with the belief that the government is the solution, that the government can step in and the government can solve problems, when in reality, a government is limited in what it can do. Government has limited resources, limited capabilities, limited personnel, and they can't be anything and everything to everyone. And so time and time again, particularly in disaster management, you are going to see failures. Not that we're failing at our mission or our job. It's that you're placing too much burden on a government apparatus as opposed to yourself as an individual. And we see this all the time. Most people are not prepared for any type of disaster. They do believe that the government's going to swoop in and will rescue them. And when you put all your eggs in that basket, you're going to be very disappointed at a time where you're facing some real heavy challenges in life. And that's why I say our education system is fundamentally broken, where people no longer take accountability. There's no personal responsibility. We're not teaching students how to be self-reliant. And those were the things that actually led to American success. It's why millions of people came here in the past with literally nothing. Because back in the day, we didn't have government assistance programs for people that were crossing the border legally or illegally. In fact, if you were a legal resident and you tried to get government assistance, you were not going to be able to get citizenship. Okay, so people sacrificed, came here with nothing, and they worked hard and they achieved the American dream. And today we're telling an entire generation to come here and don't worry, government's going to take care of you. That's not a recipe for success. Okay, Milton Friedman argued that you can't have a welfare state and open borders. It's not going to work. You can't even have a welfare state that tries to take care of all people. It will fail. And unfortunately, the student body hasn't been made aware of that.
In California, I'm sure you've read that they're going to be giving $125,000, I think, to illegal immigrants so that they can have the American dream and own a house. I mean, how many people who are American citizens, would love to own a house, but the price of housing just keeps going out of reach. And yet we hear that. So essentially what Vice President Harris has proposed in $25,000 to Americans, if she's president, is just a mini version of California. I mean, we've been following California, and how many of us really want to follow California?
The socialist paradise of California.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's part of the problem, right? We look at that bill that the legislative body passed in California, where it provides over $100,000 of interest-free loans to illegal immigrants. And it's just more money in the system. And I tell people, just look at the stimulus during the coronavirus, right? The government just printed out money and gave every single person that filed for their taxes checks. Well, guess what? We paid that back 3 times over with the inflation it caused. And unfortunately, the basic laws of supply and demand will always exist, whether you have a socialist country, a communist country, or a capitalist country. Supply and demand will exist. You could choose to ignore it like they do in socialist and communist countries, but that's why those countries collapse. The idea of giving people money and canceling student debt and just trying to take care of people cradle to grave is not sustainable. It's not going to work. And ultimately, all you're going to do is just impoverish everyone.
I had a fun weekend this weekend because I also went and saw the new Reagan movie in addition to playing the game of life. And it was so inspiring on the one hand, but on the other, it made me a little sad because of where we are today. And hearing some of the, bits and pieces of speeches that I remember as a kid, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. I mean, there were moments where I had tears in my eyes because of how far we've drifted from when those messages resonated with the vast majority of Americans. And so I think, who is that, Reagan-esque person that can kind of lead the charge there? I mean, we're fortunate at Job Creators Network. We're founded by Bernie Marcus, who's the co-founder of the Home Depot. And yes, he's a billionaire. And yes, he is the 1% and, the evil corporate tycoon kind of guy. But when he goes and speaks, or used to, he's pretty retired now. He's 94 and, kind of out of the game of speaking and doing things with Home Depot. But he would love to go and speak before students. And I mean, middle school, high school, and college students. And he would say, I'm the 1%, I'm that evil 1%. And then he would tie everything about his wealth to what he was doing with philanthropy. And he would say, how many of you have somebody in the armed services? And they, raise their hand. How many of you are parents? Do you know anybody who has been injured at war in Afghanistan or anything like that? Or how many of you know someone with autism? And what he was doing was threading the needle on all the things that he funds with his wealth through his philanthropy. And then he tied it in a nice little bow and said, that's what I do with my wealth.
Yeah, well, I mean, Bernie Marcus readily admits that he would not be able to start a Home Depot today in this regulatory environment. And it really shows you that it's a problem that government has grown too large and too overbearing. And unfortunately, it's at the behest of the people. We are the ones that drive this vehicle. And our government responds to people's demands. So as the people begin to demand more and more, well, it creates a problem. And we've been watching this slow train wreck over the last 30 years, but it really started to go into hyperspeed when 9/11 happened, where people were readily willing to trade in some of their liberties for more security. Then what happened was we were told that we have to obey and comply because the government has the best interest in mind. And it really dawned on me what we saw during the coronavirus, where you had the government step in and dictate what businesses are essential and which ones aren't. I mean, let's face it, these are politicians, people, civil servants that never really worked in the private sector determining what's essential, what's not. They determined when, where, and we could leave our home, where we could go, when, where, and how we could practice our faith, when children could go to school. And what really shocked me is how obedient everyone was, particularly the younger generation. The younger generation is supposed to be rebels, those between the ages of 16 to 25. They're supposed to rage against the machine, fight against the system, push back. But they were compliant. And it tells me that the mission has been achieved. They have a very obedient population that doesn't understand what true freedom is like. They don't realize that freedom only exists if you have economic freedom. And without economic freedom, to be able to go out and start a business, to be able to work hard, get promoted, get raises, that then you're not free. Then you're going to be a slave to the state. And Karl Marx said, they always say, well, I don't want communism, but socialism is okay. Karl Marx laid it out in his book that socialism is the first phase of communism. It's simply a vehicle to get to communism. And so we need more people to stand up and defend capitalism. And I grew up, I was a little kid in the 1980s and things were great. Patriotism was still something that both Democrats and Republicans loved. It wasn't like right-wing extremism as it's labeled today. And we saw up close and personal, the battle with the Cold War and the Soviets and the communists. Well, the student body of today is far removed from that. So they don't have those life experiences that we may have. And that's why it's more alluring to them, because they don't realize how quickly things could change, how quickly a free society could become an authoritarian society.
You know what? I did want to touch on circling back to Venezuela. You had, talked about them as a sort of a real life example. A real life success story is also in South America. Success, I don't want to jinx it, but Argentina has proven that it is possible to sort of right the ship. And although he has come in gangbusters and done, everything that he's promised to, and it does look like it is starting to have an impact. How do you think that Argentina historically will be looked at, assuming that, it continues to go well? What lessons can we learn, here in the U.S. and hopefully not allow it to get as far as it got in Argentina? And what are they doing there that you think could be implemented here to help our policies?
Well, I mean, to me, the biggest thing that Milei did over in Argentina was he literally cut the government apparatus by about 50%. Now, when we talk about cutting the government apparatus here in the United States by, let's just say, 5 or 10%, Well, you have the naysayers come out there and be like, oh, the sky is falling. We're going to go into a recession. It's going to be economically devastating. Well, Argentina, they faced some pain for a few months, but it actually worked itself out. And they're in actually really good shape right now, right? They're seeing inflation drop dramatically. They're seeing economic growth on a dramatic scale. So my advice is don't believe the naysayers out there. Everyone will scream that the sky is falling because they like the gravy train. They're being supported by the gravy train, and they don't want the gravy train of the federal apparatus ending. However, it's time to look at it because it is unsustainable going down the road. Not only is it unsustainable, we are being held hostage. We may not realize it in our individual lives, but 25%, the average state budget relies 25% on federal funds. And that's a disaster. It means that the states have to do what the federal government wants. You have numerous business and organizations that work through government grants. You have colleges and universities that get government grants. And so they're all doing the bidding of that we need a big federal apparatus. When if we begin to downsize, you will see economic growth in the United States. You will see the United States flourish. You will see capitalism begin to return. One of the big successes of the Trump administration was that for every one regulation that was passed, 3 needed to be cut. And we started to see deregulation. I live in New York. In New York, it's impossible to get any project started, okay? It takes years upon years upon years to do all the studies, the impact studies, and get all the approvals and the permitting process. Nobody wants to do business in New York. And so you have to begin to limit government power in order to really see economic growth. And I think the Argentinian president has laid out the pathway that it's not doom and gloom if you begin to downsize, that we can succeed. And I think that it would be wise for American politicians to start preaching that model. Unfortunately, too often we get lip service to the national debt. We get lip service about, balanced budgets, but it never happens and nobody ever holds them accountable. And I think that's the most frustrating thing, that there is zero accountability within our system, Republican or Democrat.
Well, Nick, you are an excellent spokesperson for this topic. It's incredible. I'm so glad that we had you on to talk about this issue because it is very scary. And as I mentioned, two things that happened to me this weekend that just sort of, were sort of a head scratcher and made me a little sad at the same time. But it certainly makes me very committed to what I'm doing. So I'm glad to know that there's someone out there like you who's committed to doing what you're doing. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters today. Thank you all for taking the time to listen in to this very important issue. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcast from. And we will be back soon with another episode.